Most boards don't get live information between meetings. So over 50% don't get any information between meetings. You can't fend off a crisis that way. The worst mistake that I see boards make when a crisis happens is that everybody decides that they want to suit up and get back into the game. They took 77 people in the US, and it's probably half the size of a normal class, and I got one of the spots, and that was my start on Wall Street. We are definitely adrenaline junkies. Things that got me into the boardroom, that 30 or 40 years of history that I had under my belt that really helped solve everything at the start actually isn't as relevant today because things are just moving too fast.
How do boards or companies mitigate the risk of a crisis?
Most PR disasters are really actual internal mistakes that just surfaced at a given point. There have been brands who've made the same mistake multiple times. I won't go through the entire thing, but
hello and welcome to the Boardroom Company Live. I'm your host, Naomi Kent, and I'm actually in St. Louis today interviewing a board director, Dorothy Burwell, who is also a partner at FGS Global. And she serves on a board here, actually in St. Louis. That's why we're here. But also serves on a board in the UK and lives in the UK. So we're going to be hearing pretty interesting story from her, ranging from also how to be an effective board member to also managing being an executive and also serving on board. So Dorothy, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me, Naomi.
Wonderful. Why don't we start out just talking about your early life? Where did you grow up? I know you're living in the UK now.
Yes.
But you didn't grow up there. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, child of the 80s. So very different Brooklyn to the one people know now. My father was a NYPD police officer. My mother was an administrative professional by vocation, I would say. I think by passion, she was an artist. She was a fashion designer at one point, took up photography, just a multi-talented individual. And they came from humble beginnings themselves, but were really, really invested in education. So the one thing that I definitely remember from childhood is that they wanted to make sure they could give us the best education they could afford. So my brother and I went to private school, even though we were living in social housing at the time.
Wow.
Up until, elementary school was over, and then we had to test into schools, and you get whatever school you test into that gets the highest grade, that's where you go. It doesn't matter if you like it. I didn't like it at the time, but I can see how it held me in good stead. And the thing that I also remember, my mom passed recently, but she really valued work and doing a good job and really putting loads of effort into the world of work. It didn't really matter if it was on a particular career track. She just took a lot of pride in it. So I've always worked since before it was legal for me to have a job. I started work at 13 when I had 2 jobs as a tutor, one on the weekend and one on the weekdays.
What were you who were you tutoring? And what were you
other
teaching?
students, so people younger than me. So in the New York City system, you have something called the Regents exam. So it's a statewide exam everybody had to take, and you have different ones each year of school. So I would tutor kids who were a couple of years behind me in subjects that I did well in. So it was usually math and science because I did a lot of math and science in school. And that was my start of being a career woman, so to speak.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Well, I think growing up in New York, I actually lived in New York for many years, right? It's a tough city, right? Did you find it tough growing up there?
Definitely. I always said if I had children that is not the place that I wanted to raise them, because it kind of forces you to grow up a lot faster than I think some other places in the US might.
I'm sure. And you were in a city where financial services is like everything, right? Like that's pretty much what Wall Street, New York City is all about. And so you got a job in finance, right? Was that one of the first jobs you had, or was there one before that?
First full-time jobs. I did internships and different things. I actually, before I went to university, did not necessarily want to work in finance. I applied to 7 or 8 universities. 7 of them, if it was 8, were to be a journalism major. And then one school, right at the end, when I was about to decide where I wanted to go, sent me a packet in the mail saying, "Hey, superstar, why don't you apply to this business program for this school in Florida that you've never heard of?" And I sent it back on a whim. They replied like lightning. I had a response back with a scholarship package within a week. And knowing that my parents couldn't really afford to send me to college, I called my best friend on the phone to tell her that we weren't going to go to uni together, and and cried myself to sleep because I knew that was
Oh,
where I needed to go. But it honestly, top 5 decisions in life, it was definitely one of them, because it was good to get away. It was very far to go, but because I wasn't there with any friends, I really had to kind of learn who I was and really grew up at the time. And I still managed to figure out what I was gonna do with my career anyway.
so journalism was sort of where you thought you were going.
Yeah,
Is that
was
was that the plan?
yeah, that was the plan. I had, done a program at New York One where I was going in to see how they actually put together spots, and that was my dream. I was gonna be an on-air anchor or a sports personality doing the ringside interviews with all of the players.
I love it. And so how did you end up at Goldman Sachs? How did that happen?
Um, so I'm a very competitive person,
Hmm.
and I'll take that. I got that from my dad. And so when I went into uni, you had to do internships every year, and so I basically had an eye out for which were the most competitive internships to do. And I did one at the Money Group one summer. Then the next year, this was back when Enron was big. It tells you my age. I interned at a company called Dynegy. Dynegy no longer exists, but it was basically like a baby Enron. It wasn't very far from here. It was in Decatur, Illinois.
And
Um,
did it fall? Did it have the same
it had this
ending as Enron? Was it
Yeah,
because of
basically,
that? Oh no.
it did the trading side of the business,
Right.
but I basically did capital budgeting. So in order for them to be able to trade the power, they had to generate the power, and I did capital budgeting for the power plants to make sure we had something to trade, and that's where I got my real kind of deep dive into finance, and then move from there. And the next year, all the banks were on campus recruiting, and I found out with like 2 days' notice that Goldman was going to be there. Ran into the career office and said, "I need to be on this list," and it was kind of written from there. I did my interview, managed to get the internship. Um, 9/11 happened after my internship year, so I really wasn't sure if I was going to get a job. But I was lucky. They took 77 people in the US, and it's probably half the size of a normal class, and I got one of the spots, and that was my start on Wall Street.
Amazing. And so while you were at Goldman Sachs, I know
Mhm.
that you really enjoyed your time there. And you had a champion that was kind of helped you move up in the
Mhm.
firm and move around.
Yeah.
And then you ended up moving to the UK also.
Yes.
Tell us about what happened then. How did that come about?
Yeah. So I'd done 2 years, as you normally do in investment banking as part of the program. And then I'd moved to the executive office to do strategy work, and really learn how the firm thought about doing deals and growing the business, which was fantastic exposure. Doing presentations for Lord Blankfein was a little bit
Hmm.
intimidating, but if you can do that, you can do anything. But I decided I wanted to go back into banking, but they didn't really have a spot for me because I'd left the division. And my boss said, "You know what? You've never been overseas. You didn't study abroad. You should really broaden your horizons, see what the business is like." I lived in Japan in my early part of my career, and it really set me up well. So reluctantly, I decided that I would move. Coincidentally, he did not tell me this before I decided. He was also moving. So he basically handpicked a few people from his old
Poached
team
you
and
and
and,
took
and
you.
brought
Yeah.
them over. And I fell out of love with banking eventually, but loved the country, and stayed for 3 more years working at Goldman before I decided to branch out and see what was out there.
So the strategy piece was obviously interesting for you, and
Hmm.
then you kind of combined it with the crisis and communication and everything
Yeah.
else that you're doing today. And actually, today I think you're working a lot with boards, right? That's
Yeah.
the vertical that you play in is actually advising boards on how to deal with a crisis and how to deal in difficult situations.
Exactly. So I love banking, and as you say, I moved into financial communications and stakeholder engagement. So didn't throw away my banking background because I was still helping people figure out how to talk to investors. But there's a much bigger world out there that businesses are operating in. Investors are a huge part, but in order for you to have your license to operate, you need to keep everybody happy. You have to keep your customers happy, your employees happy, the government happy. So I was able to take that background and really turn that into bigger strategic programs for businesses, and it still kept me in the boardroom because they were very, very important to how they were making decisions going forward. It also lit a bit of a curiosity in me. So our chairman at the time really encouraged people to do board service, and it was charter board service because that's what he does. He's been chairman of lots of different organizations, and I started out on the board of which, and for people who are in the U.S., that's big like Consumer Reports,
Hmm.
and that it's the consumer champion of the UK. It's a good hybrid board, I think, as a start because we had a for-profit business which sold a subscription publication online and in print, and that business took all of its profits and put it into the charitable aims and the advocacy work with the government that the organization did. So I sat on the top board for that and really got to understand a lot about corporate governance, a lot about business strategy because publishing has been going through a bit of a rebirth, and also the charitable piece and the advocacy piece of how do you actually work with the government in order to put forward different aims, which has held me in good stead going into some of the other businesses I've become involved in.
Now you joined the board of Post Holdings, right?
Hmm.
Which is why we're here in St. Louis. It's
Yes.
headquartered here, and I think if anyone knows, I'm sure they've heard of the brands, but they have hundreds of brands of breakfast cereals, dog food, and other things, right?
Yep.
So that you joined around 2020,
Yes.
which, as we all know, there was a lot of crisis going on, a lot of change happening in all industries. I don't think anyone was getting away with it. Tell us about how that board position kind of came about because you were
Yeah.
doing some great work, but on the strategy side, right?
Mhm.
And then you were sort of tapped for this board role. Kind of tell us about how that
Yeah.
occurred.
So I actually met the team at Post in 2017 when they bought Weetabix. So one of the things I was working on with them at the time was how do they enter the UK market as a US business, buy a business successfully, and not actually spark the ire of the local community. And that was a real big concern. They didn't want to be kind of the ugly American conglomerate coming in and taking over this beloved brand. As I know you will know,
Right.
being a Brit,
Yes.
people love their Weetabix
Didn't you
in
say
the
something about the
UK.
package coloring as well?
Yes,
And you
the
said that's
yellow
why
box. The
it's
yellow
so
box
successful.
does
Yeah.
does
You
really
can
well.
see it.
It's super recognizable.
Yeah.
One of the most loved brands.
Yeah.
But they wanted to make sure they did it well, and so what I helped them with was basically getting the message across. One, the financial message, making sure that their investors would be on board with them making the acquisition. But the harder piece was okay, how do we actually engage with all of the communities that are around where the factories are? How do we make sure the employees accept you as a new owner? How do you make sure that none of the local government or the MPs or the people in the competition authority actually take an issue with you taking over this business? So that was how I got to know the team. And I kept in touch with them over time, introduced them to others to work with when they did some other acquisitions, when they bought Bev Evans, for example. And we just had a really great relationship. So when 2020 came around and they were working on board refreshment, I was one of the first people they brought on to the board in order to get, new blood in because most people had been on since 2014 when the business floated. So they needed to start that cycle.
Right. Fantastic. And I think, you know, do all businesses take that much care when they acquire a business? I feel like there's a lot of care that they took, right?
Yeah.
Acquiring a business, making sure that the consumers, because it's a very old brand. I don't know how long Weetabix has been around, but I think my grandparents used to eat it. So I think it's been around for a while. But when you're acquiring a business, that's a lot of work that goes into it, right?
There's a
Potentially.
lot of work and a lot of thought if you do it well.
Hmm.
I have seen both sides of that when people have not taken as much care, have taken for granted that money was going to be the cure of all ills. But I do think for a board, when you are helping to guide a management team, one of the things you have to do is really think about how accepted are we going to be? Do we have the license to operate in this particular jurisdiction? And if we don't have it, how do we gain it? And then how do we maintain it? And so that's a big strategic question. And I think a lot of board members will know that inherently, but people who are new to a board, they might not, from their particular kind of professional silo, understand how big a responsibility that is.
Now, you also sit on the board of Pennon Group PLC, which is a
Mhm.
FTSE 250 company, right?
Yes.
In the UK, and that came about a little later, right? A few years later,
Yeah,
or
so at the end of 2022, early 23 is when I joined that board. Um, in a in a similar situation in that there was a crisis going on, but specific to the industry. So over the course of 2020, 2021, 22, people started to notice because they had more time at the beaches and in the lakes, that there was a lot more pollution than they thought there would be in the waterways. And this isn't isolated to Pennon. The entire industry had been underinvested for a very long time. And as a result, a lot of things were going wrong because the systems were being used a lot more, people were at home a lot more, and we really needed to get that under control. So in the period that I joined, boards were looking for people with different skill sets to help to navigate that, to think about, okay, how are we going to deal with the pressure that we're getting from the government? How are we going to deal with a much more difficult environment with the regulator? And also, how do we actually damp down some of the protests we're getting from the community in order for us to be able to get on with doing a lot of work and also raise the capital that we need to do it, because it's a very expensive endeavor trying to revamp an entire water system for a country. We're still working on it, so don't ask me what the solution is. But we are, I think, on the right track, and there's been a lot of reform that's actually happened in that period. So we're fingers crossed we'll be
Mm.
over the hump very soon.
When I think about those two boards, most people would look at those two boards and say, well, they got nothing in common, right? You got food and you got utilities. But I think when you think about it from it's an essential, right? That
Yeah,
that consumers need, and it's
yeah,
not a certain type of person potentially, right? It's just anyone, right? So
yeah,
we all need to eat, and we all need,
and
and we probably most of us have pets, and then there's also the essentials like utilities.
yeah.
What do you enjoy? I mean, obviously you're FGS Global, where you actually advise boards, so of course having board experience, I'm sure it helps you understand their world. But what do you enjoy most about serving on boards?
Yeah. Um, I think when you're an advisor and you're outside the boardroom, one of the great things is you get a lot of variety and you see lots of different problems. When you're in the boardroom, you actually get to go a little bit deeper into the problem. So that's one thing. So there's just an intellectual stimulus, I think, of being in the boardroom and helping a management team to really move the ball a little bit forward. Um, there's the people aspect, I think, also of being in the boardroom. And I don't just mean my fellow board members, I've been really working with the management team to actually see them grow. So every board member has a talent that they bring in to the room. So, some people bring their professional talents. Some people bring a different kind of talent in terms of trying to inspire the management team to do their greatest work. And I think for me, it's really looking at team dynamic and what is it that will actually help the team to blend between the exec and the board and between the exec itself, and say, okay, what is it that we need to do collectively in order for us to be the best as a group? And so I really like that dynamic and just being able to be involved in it.
That's wonderful. And I know you mentioned earlier, you said, I'm showing my age, but actually, when you joined your first board,
Hmm.
you were certainly on the younger end of the average. I think that we talked about this, right?
Yeah,
Average
yeah,
age of a brand new board director in an S&P 500 company. We're just looking at a small subset, but is around sort of 56 to 58.
yeah,
And you were just, I mean, it's public information. I don't know if you talk about your age, but
yeah.
you were just 40 when you
Yes, I
joined
was
your
40.
first board. And so there was clearly a lot of trust in the work that you could do. And you even said you were already working with them,
Hmm.
right? Do you think that boards should be younger? Do you think that there's a benefit to
Mm.
having younger board members?
So, um, I won't go through the entire thing, but we did a study actually recently, so at FGS, and it was a two-part study. The first part was looking at what is the dynamic that's going on in the environment that boards are sitting in, and that was a survey of 20,000 people, 200 business leaders and political leaders, and we saw that there was, four things that people saw as really setting the scene. The first thing was dealing with multilateralism being basically dead and strongman leadership being up. The crisis of pessimism, which some people listening might have recognized, and even here in the US, which I think is generally a very optimistic country, 51% of people said that the best years of the country are behind them, which is frightening.
That's sad,
And
isn't it?
you
Yeah.
see all of that play out in consumer sentiment, right? Nationalism being, at the forefront, most people thinking that their government should be looking inward, not outward, and also being really concerned about AI and the impact on the workforce. So for people in the boardroom, I think that has really changed the way they need to think and the problems that they actually need to solve. So I'm getting to your question around the age of board members. We took all of that and we went and just spoke to board members only and have been asking them, what's changed about your job? How is going into the boardroom now feel different or seem different? And most of them have said, you know what, this job is a lot harder. It's taking a lot more time. And frankly, I don't necessarily feel as equipped as I once did to solve the problems because the things that got me into the boardroom, that 30 or 40 years of history that I had under my belt that really helped solve everything at the start actually isn't as relevant today because things are just moving too fast and it's way too chaotic
Wow.
in terms of the outside world. And so in trying to help people find a solution, we coined what we call adaptive capacity. And that's being able to unlearn some of your old skills to learn new skills, to solve new problems, and really come up with different solutions in new environments without throwing away the wisdom and the judgment that tells you what's good from bad. All that said, I do think that the tension that they've had with management teams a lot of the times has been, I've got this new problem. Are you really able or the right person to help guide me? So I think what we'll probably see, and what I'm hearing when I get recruiters calling, is that people are looking for people with recency. So people are dealing with real problems today and getting more kind of sitting execs on the boards or recent execs on boards in order to be able to deal with things in the context that we're currently living in.
Right. Because I think it's important to have a very varied group of people, right? A
Hmm.
diverse group of people who can come from different, situations and different industries. But what I think is also interesting is you have to pivot also on the cultural differences because you
Hmm.
mentioned the UK versus the US. The consumers are different,
Hmm.
the way they purchase things are different, where they purchase things are different too.
Yes.
So do you find it fun to kind of go back and forth and kind of pivot between those two
Yeah, I
cultures?
do. I do. UK consumers and US consumers. I mean, if you picked a country in Europe to be similar to the US, the UK would be most similar, and probably because of the shared language. But there definitely is a different mindset and a different taste profile. No one loves sugar like an American, but
That's true.
it's really nice to be able to actually do the juxtaposition and look at the comparison of what does well where in which market, and it serves me well in my day job when boards ask me, how is something actually going to play out when we put it into the UK market, or how is something going to play out when we put it into a European market, being able to see all of those.
It's interesting that the flavors thing you just mentioned. So, I grew up in Asia, and my dad he worked for an American company, and he would go to the USA, and he would come back with a suitcase,
Mm-hmm.
and it would be candy and all kinds of stuff from the
Hmm.
USA. And there was always grape flavored things, and I always found that fascinating because we never had grape flavor anything,
Yeah.
and the grape
Yeah.
didn't really taste like a grape. Like it was
Y-
an odd flavor,
Yeah.
but yeah, it there's even flavors and things that are totally different. And I think when we're in the UK and in the US, we think, oh, we all speak the same language, like you said.
Yeah.
We must be the same. But it's a different country at the end of the day, right? So you really have to deal with that as well.
Yeah. I didn't really understand the concept of meat flavored chips for American or crisps if you're in the UK.
Bacon flavored
Yeah.
chips
Yeah.
is
What
great.
would they? Oh,
We,
yeah. I thought it was completely baffling. It's not so bad, but it was completely baffling when I
you
first
got
got
used to
there.
it.
Yeah.
I know you drink tea now, so you're
I
not a, you're
drink
not a
tea.
coffee
Yeah,
drinker
I'm not a
anymore.
coffee drinker. I love my tea, and I love 11sies and tea at 3 p.m. So that it's a civilized way to live life, I say.
Well, I think when you move to another country, you kind of have to embrace what's there. I think if you go to a country and you try and live your life that you lived in your other country, I think you're going to
Hmm.
be disappointed because it's just not going to work, right?
Yeah,
You're going to be like, like a coffee in the UK is very much like a European coffee, like they have espressos and things like that.
yeah, it's very
Whereas
different.
here it feels like more of like a milkshake, right? So it's just different, right? You have to
Yeah,
kind of embrace it.
yeah. I think the thing about being abroad is I think you actually figure out who you are. So I've had two opportunities to live away from home, so to speak. So when I moved to Florida, and then the second time moving to the UK. And I think for anyone who's done it, you know that you can't rely on what you knew, but also you're not kind of put into that box of what people expect of you. So you actually get to know, okay, do I like that? I don't have to like it now. So do I really like it? Is this how I want to live my life? Are these the kind of choices that I'm going to make? So I do. I back to my old boss. He was right. It was one of the most probably formative things I think for my personality and probably the way I see the world and the way I make decisions now.
Now, let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about crisis and communication
Hmm.
and every business. I don't think any business is, void of it. But there's obviously you bring a lot of subject matter expertise in this
Hmm.
space. Um, wh- how do boards or companies mitigate the risk of a crisis? Like, is there a way to do that, or is it just inevitable?
Yeah. So I've been talking to a lot of boards about that. So one of the things we found this in the study, but I know this as a board member, is that most boards don't get live information between meetings. So over 50% don't get any information between meetings. You have your 4 meetings a year if you're in the US, and you just get your pack the week before. You can't fend off a crisis that way. So I think the first thing to deal with in your board is what kind of transparency do you have and what kind of relationship do you have between meetings and conversations do you have between meetings with your executive in order to be able to understand what's going on without you having to be a pest and knocking on their door all the time. Because you don't want to distract them, but at the same time, you need to be able to be useful, and that means you need to be kind of on the money. Then there's kind of the governance structure around what information is actually useful to you. They don't need to tell you everything that they discuss in their executive meetings. They need to tell you what's going to help you make that resource allocation decision, what's going to help you make a geopolitical decision about what do we need to do with the supply chain or what countries do we actually want to be operating in. And so when you get that rhythm, then the next level is what kind of decision architecture do you have with your board? The worst mistake that I see boards make when a crisis happens is that everybody decides that they want to suit up and get back into the game that they were in when they were an executive. And now you're getting in the way. There's a whole set of people that you hired to do those jobs. And if you don't think you're up to them, then you need to hire a different set of people. But you should not be getting in the way.
And how
What
do you mean getting in the way? Do you mean
so
just sort of just creating more work for people,
creating more
essentially?
work,
Yeah.
asking questions and demanding the answers come to you before the executive has time to process them. There's a you set up a cadence, right? And you set up a set of people who are going to be there to make the decisions. Let's take a cyber crisis, for example. If you used to work as an IT professional, you probably don't need to suit up for this. You need to get the information and be the person who says, I've seen this many things before. Let me help you triage the decision of should we pay ransom? What are the different things that can happen? But you don't need to actually involve yourself. As an advisor, I've seen it when boards involve themselves and they'll start shooting off emails to the advisors with their very strong opinions about what the executive should be doing. And it's just those sorts of things that create a little bit of
It's almost like a
chaos.
time wait. They're wasting time
They're
now. And
wasting
when you're in a
time
crisis, surely it's a minute by minute, hour by hour,
minute by
right?
minute, and
Yeah.
everybody needs to know where they're most useful. So
Mm.
that's what I mean about there's a what I call decision architecture. You know, everybody knows what if you set up the roles before the crisis happens, and that means you need to actually do some scenario planning and some rehearsals with each other. If you do that, then people know where they're supposed to play. The reason why people get involved isn't to meddle, it's because they feel like they're at a loss for being useful and they want to help things move as fast as possible. It's an effort to be helpful. Let's help each other understand where we're most helpful by setting that up in advance.
What's your advice for, you talked about scenario planning. What's your advice for board members if they're not doing any scenario planning? Should they ask about it? Like, do we have a plan for X or Y happening? What
Yeah.
should a board member do?
Yes, I think you should ask what's the plan and how does that actually incorporate the board members' views and when we play. A lot of times we would encourage boards to set aside some time in the strategy days in order for them to actually do a bit of that together. Um, you can bring in an expert if it's an area in which nobody in the board has an experience.
Mhm.
So it could be in consultancy, but it can be an individual expert that you're bringing in who can help triage things. I've sat on some of my boards where we've brought in an academic, for example, who's actually been studying something that we're really interested in. And in the UK was water industry reform, because we were going through a period where the government was looking at that. And so we brought in someone to help us think about what are the things that we're going to go to the government and ask for as they're thinking about water industry reform, and what is actually happening across different markets that we should know about in order for us to be a little bit more influential. So there are set pieces during the year when you can do this, but don't just wait for that if it's 12 months from now. See if you can set aside time with the chair to talk to the CEO about how we can actually put together something to make sure that the board is as tooled up and as not just tooled up, but as ready as possible to tackle the unexpected.
And do you do any advisory work around actual communication in the boardroom with between board members and leaders? Like, do you advise on that as well? Is that part of what you do?
So in terms of the interpersonal relationship, we probably don't do the whole board and the exec, but we will work with the CEO and the chair
Okay, to
on
make
the
sure.
make sure, because that honestly that's the most important dynamic. The rest of the board is not going to really be able to influence it. The chair sets the tone, and that's something that we've heard in the research. That's something that I've seen. If the chair is not getting along with the CEO, then you, as the REMCO chair, are not going to have a great relationship with the CPO when it comes time to set compensation, because those two haven't seen eye to eye, and you no longer have the permission to go to that executive to speak to them. So that's where we actually need to work on that. And we'll talk with the CEO to think about, okay, well, how are you setting yourself up in order to present problems in a way that's constructive and you don't feel too vulnerable? And chair, how do you actually get the best out of your CEO?
And what about communications just in general? I mean, we talked about the acquisition of Weetabix and making sure that
Mm-hmm.
there was internal, external communication. What does that look like in a crisis? Is it one of the most important things that a company should be looking at, or?
Definitely,
Mm.
definitely. I think um, so. If we look at the internal dynamic, your employees are your ambassadors, so they need to feel very proud of what they're doing. And if something does go wrong, because things do go wrong, they need to know that there's a best effort to put things right, so that when they're asked by their family or their friends or the customer in particular, that they know exactly what to say. So that's one of the first things that we think about is how do you actually set that up so that people have the right things and the right tools to hand. And then in terms of the external dynamic, making sure that the right spokespeople, principally the CEO, but anybody else who's interacting actually understands what the current stage of communication is, when we're actually going to go out or with any more information, and that you have a very well organized team going out there with a kind of united message.
Do you think that brands can recover from like a PR crisis? Like, is it possible to recover?
They can, particularly if they know when to apologize.
Okay. And
So
when should that be?
as soon as
Almost
possible,
immediately.
usually.
Yeah.
As soon as possible, usually. But it's not just that, but it's also getting into the root cause of where the issue actually happened. So lots of people put out kind of surface apologies and they get discredited immediately, because if you don't really know where things went wrong, and this is, it's an operational thing. This is about the decision architecture that I talked about. If you don't really have a handle on that, then people will lose faith, because something is bound to happen again, and it starts to become a pattern. And I won't bring up any brands
Mhm.
in particular, but you've seen that where there have been brands who've made the same mistake multiple times. One year and then the next year, and then people just decide that they're just not going to deal with it anymore.
Yeah, so you have to sort of be careful. If you've made one mistake, it's okay.
Yeah, but then get to the root cause
Be
analysis,
careful not to do that.
so
Yeah.
that you can deal with it. Because most PR disasters are really actual internal mistakes that just surfaced at a given point.
And how involved are boards in the responses generally? Do you see some companies sort of keeping them sort of in the back burner, or are some of them going to the board with these things? Is it
It
a mix?
varies. It
Yeah.
varies. I think I think when it gets to be fever pitched and people are actually calling on the board to be involved, the board definitely does get involved. But most times, a low level issue, which if you actually believe it's just a PR issue, not a serious operational issue, most times those things actually don't get to the board. And if they're not handled well, by the time they get to the board, it's very difficult to actually pull it back.
Oh dear. No, I
Yeah.
can imagine.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the reasons why I think it's really good to have good communication between the CEO and the chair so that they're getting that counsel when they're making the decision. If you are only talking, in those 4-month periods, then it's very difficult for the CEO and the chair to actually coordinate.
The role of the chair is really important.
Mm.
I know in some US companies it's the same person. How does it work when that's the case?
Then you have the lead director,
Yeah.
which you hope is someone that the executive chairman really feels they can rely on
Mm.
as a wise point of counsel.
Mhm.
So, there's different models work, and when a business is running well, there's no reason for you to question the executive chairman
Right.
and their role. But you do need to have a strong lead director there who is able to, with an independent, mindset, come and say, listen, these are some other things that we should be considering.
Now I can tell just in this topic, I mean, you really enjoy it, right?
I
Like you
do.
like a good crisis. I
I
think most
love
people are running in the opposite direction. You're running
No,
toward the
we are
crisis.
definitely adrenaline junkies in the crisis management
Where did that
industry.
come from? Is that New York City? Because New
I don't know.
York's, there's a lot going on in New York. I
Pro-
feel like there's a lot, right?
Now that
Noise
you
and
say it,
action, and
probably a little bit of that. I grew up with my father was a cop, so
there's a lot of action there.
there's
There's a lot of action there.
you get to know that. I think also I like things that are really fast paced, and I like solving problems. And generally, when you're working in crisis management, you don't necessarily know what the right answer is, but you definitely know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And there's a lot of satisfaction in being able to get something under control for people who feel like the sky is falling from everywhere.
Right. So you're very calm when things are on fire. You're just
I
calm.
try to be.
Okay.
I try to
We
be.
can't always be, right?
Yeah.
No, I love that. It's very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the committees that you sit on,
Yeah.
because committee work is really important. And I know, so you have a day job, you got these two boards, and you have the committees. It's a lot of work, but you don't chair the committees. I think if chairing the committee is probably a bit more work than that, right? Is that
Yeah.
or
I do
but
chair
you're
one
on? Oh,
committee.
you do chair a
I
committee.
do
Which
chair a
one?
committee. So I chair the ESG committee,
Okay, at
and
Pennon
at
Group.
Pennon Group, and we still have ESG committees in the UK, but principally, the environment is very important. It is integral to what we do as a water business. You want to make sure people
Sure.
have clean water. We want to protect the environment, and so we spend a lot of time in that particular committee, really trying to create leverage, right? So the point of the committees is we can't do everything in the board. And so sometimes we have to have a deep dive on specific issues. And in that one, I'm very focused on, okay, what kind of culture do we have in the business? And what is it that the board should be helping with in order to make sure that we're continuously improving the culture if it's required or moving things forward? We have a new CEO that's just come in.